Let's go back for a moment to Aristotle's three lives, which, as you remember, when we add the life of the pursuit of wealth, are actually four lives. Those three lives, in addition to wealth, were the lives of gratification, of political activity, and third, of study. The life of gratification is a life that centers around the pursuit of pleasure. And if you remember, Aristotle warned us against thinking that we could simply reject the life of pleasure as a possible best life for a human being for a couple of reasons. One reason is that in order to call someone happy, surely they're going to need to have pleasure in their lives. And the second reason is that the whole issue of pleasure is more complicated than any simple answer will clarify for us. And today, we really get into how complicated Aristotle's relationship with pleasure can be. Along with Aristotle's discussion of intemperance and incontinence and their relationship to reason that we talked about in the last video, Aristotle's final word on pleasure in the Nicomachean Ethics has to do with a distinction between what he calls proper and alien pleasures. Pleasures, he says, are relative to activities. A given pleasure is good or bad in relation to a good or a bad activity. But we have to warn ourselves not to jump to a conclusion from that. So that doesn't mean that pleasures related to good activities are good, or that pleasures related to bad activities are bad. It's actually more complicated than that. We need to add some nuance before we can get clarity on that. So Aristotle gives this distinction between proper pleasures and alien pleasures. So looking at page 189, this is also apparent from the fact that each pleasure is proper to the activity that it completes, for the proper pleasure increases the activity. If, for instance, we enjoy doing geometry, we become better geometers. Each pleasure increases the activity. What increases it is proper to it. And since the activities are different in species, what is proper to them is also different in species. Okay, so what should we take from that quotation? In particular, we should take that a pleasure is proper to an activity if it completes and perfects the activity, and if it promotes our desire to do the activity for its own sake and not for the sake of the pleasure alone. Here are some examples of proper pleasures. The beautiful sound that my Steinway grand piano, which you see in the background sometime, that beautiful sound of this instrument makes me want to practice more. So that's a proper pleasure. The pleasure I take in having a positive influence over my students' lives makes me want to put more effort into my teaching and to do it really well. Also, the pleasure I take in being a skillful driver makes me take pride in avoiding accidents when other drivers do something stupid. And that in turn makes me a more skillful driver. That pleasure makes me a more skillful driver. And finally, the pleasure an interrogator takes in torturing the prisoner of war she is questioning makes her a more effective torturer. It completes and perfects the activity. Yes, I know that the last example is different from the rest, but it's going to turn out to be the most interesting one. Here on 189, again, below the previous quotation that I read, Aristotle talks about alien pleasures. And we see here some activities are impeded, that is obstructed by pleasures from other activities. He gives the example of someone who's having a conversation, but they love flute music. And so if someone is playing the flute in the background, they get distracted from the conversation. And in the second paragraph here, paragraph 4, if we're trying to do two things at once, then the pleasure of one activity, if one activity happens to be more pleasant than the other, then that more pleasant activity is going to push out the other activity and make us pay more attention to the more pleasant activity. So again, here we can draw just a few important points from that passage on alien pleasures. A pleasure is alien to an activity if it detracts from the activity, if it causes us to do the activity less completely or less perfectly, if it promotes our desire to do the activity for the sake of that pleasure, or if it lessens our desire to do the activity at all. I understand not every one of these points is clear. I think they will become clear when we talk about examples. So here are some examples of alien pleasures. You're studying. You decide to study next to a window, and the pleasure of looking out the window distracts you from studying. So the pleasure of looking out the window is an alien pleasure with regard to that activity of studying because it distracts you from it. You do it less perfectly, less completely, because it's accompanied with that pleasure. Or something that I think is true for a lot of us, we go to the gym to work out, we see attractive people there. The pleasure of seeing attractive people makes you want to go to the gym, maybe even to go a little more than you ordinarily would. But that pleasure, especially if you indulge in it a little bit too much, will distract you from working out as effectively as you otherwise would while you're there, right? So the pleasure of seeing attractive people is a pleasure that you get while you're working out, but it's not the same as the pleasure of working out. In fact, it detracts a bit from the activity. Final example, again, a funny one, but it's going to turn out to be really revealing. You're committing a crime on a really nice day, or at least thinking of it, and the sunshine makes you want to go to the beach instead of robbing the 7-Eleven, right? What's going to happen if you actually do decide to rob the 7-Eleven is you're going to be distracted from it. You're not going to do it as perfectly or completely because you're thinking, okay, it's great that I'm going to get money or donuts or a bad pizza from 7-Eleven without having to pay for it, but it would also be really cool to go to the beach. Okay, so here are the differences between proper and alien pleasures. The proper pleasures make an activity more exact, longer, and better. An alien pleasure damages it. Proper pain destroys activity, right? So if writing or math is not pleasurable but painful for us, we're not going to want to write or do math because of the pain of that. So proper pleasures and pains have contrary effects on an activity. Proper ones are ones that arise from the activity in its own right. So you might say a proper pleasure is a pleasure that is intrinsic to the activity. And alien pleasures ruin an activity, but not in the same way as pain. And that will probably take us back to our examples. Now, what you want to pay close attention to is there is no such thing as a pleasure that is intrinsically proper. There is no such thing as a pleasure that is intrinsically alien. A pleasure is only proper or alien in relation to a particular, this last word should be activity. A pleasure is proper or alien in relation to a particular activity. Okay, so at this point, you're really confused. So you have two questions. So are proper pleasures good? And are alien pleasures bad? And the answer is maybe sometimes it depends. Okay, how are we going to get this straight? So let's try filling everything in, all the information we've got so far, into a fairly simple chart, right? So clearly, the proper pleasure of a good activity is good. If you love doing math, then your pleasure in doing math is going to make you better at doing math. The proper pleasure of a good activity is good. The alien pleasure of a good activity, as you would expect, is bad. So if, for instance, you are studying history, but in the course of studying history, There are some nice illustrations, and you get interested in the artistic qualities of those illustrations in such a way that you lose the thread of the history that's there. That would be an alien pleasure to the activity of studying history, taking special pleasure in the art for art's sake that you find in the book. That would be bad. It would detract from the activity of studying history. Neither one of those is a surprise. Here are the surprises, right? The proper pleasure of a bad activity is bad. What do I mean by that? Well, that's the torturer, right? Remember back here, we had this weird example, right? The last example here, the pleasure an interrogator takes in torturing the prisoner of war she is questioning makes her a more effective torturer. Well, torturing people is bad. The pleasure, the proper pleasure of torturing people makes the act of torturing more complete, more perfect, so to speak. You're a better torturer. And so the proper pleasure of a bad activity is bad because it makes the activity worse. And now we have what to me is the most interesting account of Aristotle's view of pleasure. And that is his claim that the alien pleasure of a bad activity is good. Now, what on earth could you mean by that? Well, my favorite example is always the bank robber, right? So the bank robber goes into the bank, and he or she is, trying to rob the bank as best they can to get as much money as they possibly can. But the bank robber sees one of the people who works at the bank, this very attractive, fit, well-dressed blonde person, let's say, and gets distracted from the work of robbing the bank, from the activity of robbing the bank, right? That means that the bank robber will not be as good at doing the evil action that he wanted to do. So the alien pleasure, the distraction that this attractive person represents to the bank robber, that actually makes the activity less bad. And so Aristotle says that the alien pleasure of a bad activity is good. Now, one of the consequences of this has to do with habits, right? Maybe more than one of them. So remember that a virtue is a habit. It's a habit of action and the other 8 or 9 parts of it. And what's the significance of this chart for that? Well, let's say you're involved in a bad habit. By saying that an alien pleasure to a bad activity is good, one of the things that Aristotle is telling you is if you have a bad habit, one of the things you can do to help yourself ease out of that bad habit is to introduce an alien pleasure to the activity, right? So let's say you love eating fried food just a little bit too much, right? And so you have a habit of doing that. Well, if you made a rule that anytime you were going to eat fried food, you were also going to talk to your friend on the phone, you would be joining an alien pleasure to it, right? An alien pleasure to the bad activity of eating too much fried food. And by doing that, you would distract yourself from the activity. You would do it less completely and less perfectly. You would probably eat fried food less often, and when you eat it, you would eat less of it. The other thing that's interesting, and here's a point that I'm not sure that Aristotle completely sees all the way through, and I think some contemporary people who work on motivation maybe get this point a little clearer than Aristotle himself does. And that is when we're trying to form a good habit. Yes, ideally, we would want to use the proper pleasure of that good activity in order to reinforce that habit. But before we have formed that habit, one of the ways that we can get ourselves to form the good habit in the first place is by attaching a pleasure to it that may not be an alien pleasure, but it's also not an intrinsic pleasure, it's an extrinsic pleasure. So let's say that, like me, you really love dark chocolate, but you really do not enjoy going over your credit card statement to make sure that someone hasn't committed fraudulent transactions on your account. Well, you need to get in the habit of doing that. That's a good thing, and it's going to save you some trouble in the course of your financial life. But if you have trouble getting yourself to do it, you might say, okay, I'm allowed to eat chocolate, dark chocolate, any chocolate, only at times when I'm going over my credit card statement. Now, that would help you to form the good habit of going over that credit card statement. And once you have formed it, you might very well be able to take pleasure in the fact that you caught someone who was trying to put a fraudulent charge on your account and maybe saved a few $100s. And after that, you've really got the habit of doing it because you have an intrinsic pleasure, a proper pleasure of that activity attached to it that will reinforce the activity every time you do it. So that's just sort of a footnote that maybe Aristotle also, when he's talking about forming habits, maybe he also needs to talk about extrinsic pleasures that we use in the process of habituating ourselves to do a good activity that then can be discarded in the favor of intrinsic proper pleasures later on. So my hope is that this chart makes everything clear about Aristotle's word about pleasure. We can say one more time that when you look at the intemperance incontinence distinction, along with the proper and alien pleasure distinction, Aristotle's answer to is pleasure good or bad is it depends, right? Everything depends upon the human being having the proper rational relationship to pleasure.